Okay, so today I want to try and give you an update on the latest sharding design and try and give you some of the technical details as well as some of the intuition. So sharding basically is a scaling solution. We want to go from one blockchain to many blockchains. These are some of the shards. They're just plain vanilla blockchains with headers and bodies. And each shard is quite small, so it can be handled by a validator, and that helps with decentralization. And then we have the scaling when we have multiple shards. From the point of view of the user, it's OK to be a light client for all the shards. So you don't have to be a full node and download all the data for the shards, and that's part of what provides the scalability. And from the point of view of a validator, an active participant in the system, you will get assigned several blocks at random at different points in time. So also, you will not have to download all the blocks, but only a very small fraction. So in addition to decentralization and scaling, there's kind of two hard things that we want to try and achieve with sharding. Number one is security. We want to make it very hard for a specific attacker to target one of the shards and try and do something like a 50% attack or a censorship attack or try and put unavailable blocks in the shards. And the other thing we want to try and do is connectivity. So each shard is like its own different universe, and we want to try and connect the shards together so that we have these network effects between the contracts on the various shards. So this, at a high level, is the layers of the design. We have 4 layers. And it's quite nice because it's very modular. So at the top, we have Ethereum 1.0, the legacy chain, the chain as it exists right now, and we use it for deposits. So to become a validator, you'll make a 32D ETH deposit. And then we have a layer which we call the beacon chain, and this is kind of the system layer for Ethereum 2.0. It will do things which are kind of separate from the transactions per se, but will help the overall Ethereum 2.0 system, which contains both sharding and Casper, to progress nicely. And then we have the shards, where the actual data gets processed. And in the shards, we've kind of split the data layer from the state layer. So what that means is that we're going to have a phase 1 of shards. Sorry, I don't. So we're going to split the shards into 2 phases. So phase 1 is going to be about coming to consensus about the data that comes in the shards, and that's what we call the data layer. And this is hard because it's kind of a consensus game. There could be different blocks, but it's about choosing one. And then we have the very last part, which is the EVM 2.0. So we're going to revamp the EVM, and this EVM is going to go in the shards, and it's going to give meaning to the various transactions. So we're going to have a notion of state, a notion of gas, a notion of state changes. And it turns out that, at least from a theoretical standpoint, the EVM is the easy part, because once you have consensus on the data and you have the rules of the EVM that have been agreed, then it's just a matter of plugging the data in the EVM to get a deterministic output. OK, so this is in terms of common infrastructure for all the shards. We have the beacon chain in the middle, and the legacy chain plays a much minor role in our design now. OK, so the main thing that the legacy chain does is basically just receive these deposits. And we have what we call a one-way burn contract. It sounds a bit scary, but basically it's the place where you deposit some real ETH in the legacy chain, and then you will be given a slot in the validator pool in the beacon chain. And the reason why it's a one-way thing is because you'll be able to withdraw your deposit and your rewards in the shards. But this withdrawal process will only be possible once we have the EVM 2.0. OK, so once you're in the validator pool, you will be assigned on a randomized basis various roles. You can be assigned as a beacon proposer, so basically extending and maintaining the beacon chain, which is this common infrastructure for all the shards. Or you might be called upon as a shard proposer or attester. So that's the same thing for the beacon chain, but this time for the shards, so that the shards can progress and grow. And then there's this final role, which is the role of a notary. And notaries kind of provide the glue between the shards and the beacon chain. Okay, so let's quickly look at some of the core services that the beacon chain provides. And there's basically 3 of them. Number 1 is about randomness and clocking. So the beacon chain will provide this heartbeat for the rest of the system to follow. And on some of these heartbeats, there will be random numbers. And the random numbers are especially important because they're used to sample or to shuffle the validators across the shards. And that's one of the key security things that we want to achieve. The other thing that the beacon chain does is that it includes what I called crosslinks. So crosslinks are these small objects which connect the shards to the beacon chain. And it turns out that we've merged Casper and Sharding together in such a way that the crosslinks are dual-purposed to also be Casper votes. I'll talk about that more later. And then the last thing that the beacon chain does is kind of more boring, but still very important, is accounting. So it maintains the ledger of all the validators, and for each validator, there's a balance, which is the deposit plus the rewards minus the penalties. And this also includes slashing, which is a very big penalty if you've done something really bad. So this is kind of a simplified diagram of the relationship between the beacon chain and the shards. So time goes from left to right. And the beacon chain, towards the beginning of the epoch, will provide a random number. And this random number is used to select some validators in the shards, which we call proposers, attesters, and notaries, and that will grow the shard. And as time progresses to the right, the shards will build what is called a crosslink, and so that's the yellow star. The crosslink gets included into the beacon chain. The beacon chain kind of feeds off these crosslinks, and then you have the crosslink, which is dual purpose as a Casper vote, hence the black ghost. Okay, so one thing I should talk about is the randomness. So the beacon chain is meant to provide these random numbers, and how exactly does it provide it? So we have 2 main ways of building random numbers, one which is slightly weaker and one which is slightly stronger. So on the left here, you have RANDAO. So you may already be familiar with RANDAO. The idea is that as a validator, you commit to a chain of commits and reveals, which is secret to you. And then once you're called upon during the RANDAO period as a proposer, you're meant to reveal one of your RANDAO numbers. And once you reach the end of the epoch, you take all these RANDAO numbers, you XOR them, and that can be your random number. The problem with this kind of random number is that it is subject to some degree of manipulation. Every proposer has basically 2 choices. They can either reveal the number that they've committed to or not reveal. And so one way to rephrase it is that they have 1 bit of attack surface. And this is especially bad for the revealers towards the end, in this case, the revealer with the red one, because he has full knowledge of what has been revealed previously, and so he can know ahead of time what the final random number will be. And so one of the things we're exploring is this delay function. So the idea of a delay function is that you have an input, and it takes a very long time to compute the output, but it's very, very fast to verify the output. And so what we can do is we can take the random number from RANDAO, which is kind of imperfect, and feed it through as an input to the delay function, and then use the output of the delay function as the actual random number, a much stronger one. And the reason it's much stronger is that we can make the delay to be long enough so that even the last revealer would not have the computational resources to produce the final random number in both cases where he reveals or he doesn't reveal. Okay, so let's look at the shard growth. How do shards grow? So one of the things for healthy shard growth is the idea of proposer. So you take the validator pool and then you partition it into much smaller proposal pools, one pool per shard. And in order to make good proposals, a validator needs to have access to the state for that shard. And the reason is that in order to prioritize the transactions with the gas, you need to know whether or not the transactions are valid, and so you need to have access to the state. And this is a constraint, which means that even though there is some shuffling going on within these proposer pools, it happens quite slowly, maybe once every month or so. Okay, so you have the proposal pool for one shard, and you have the random number, and that is going to give you an ordered list of proposers for your epoch, let's say 128 period. And on the left here, you have the tip of the shard, which is a block, and the next proposer is meant to build on top of that tip with a new block. What we've done is we actually have the notion of attestation or co-proposing, where all the other proposers in the pool are invited to sign off the proposals. And so this is what happens. The other proposers sign off. It doesn't have to be all of them, just some threshold. And then the next proposer can come in with a new proposal. And the idea of this attestation is that if one of the proposer, who's a single entity, who kind of has a monopoly over proposing within the small period of time, decides to do something bad, so in this case, instead of building on the tip of the shard, it's kind of forking off, building on the parent, and that's bad. And so what we'd want is that the co-proposers don't sign off, and basically this block gets rejected. Okay, now let's talk about notarization. The idea of notarization, or the goal of notarization, is to try and solve the data availability problem. So you have these shards with block data, and because no one has downloaded all the data for all the shards, how do you know that the data is actually available? So there's a question mark on all these blocks. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take the whole validator pool, which can be extremely large. It can have millions of validators. And we're going to select randomly a very small committee, relatively small, of size 1,000. And we're going to call this committee a committee of notaries. And one of the assumptions that we're making when we design the system is that in the validator pool as a whole, at least 2/3 of the validators are honest, so they're the angels. And it turns out that if you have 2/3 of the validators in the global validator pool that are honest, then if you sample 1,000, then with very, very high probability, at least half of the committee of notaries is going to be honest. And so we can use that to basically attest for data availability of blocks. So how does it work? So we have our shard, and we segment it into epochs of length 128. And for each epoch, we have a small committee of 1,000 validators. And we're going to ask these validators two things. Number one, to download the blocks. And number two, if they were successful in downloading the blocks, then signing off. And it suffices to sign off kind of on the checkpoint, which is the boundary of the epoch. And if you have at least half of the notaries who have signed off, because you have the assumption that half of the committee is honest, it means that at least one of the people signing off is honest, and therefore they have the data, and therefore they can share it with the world. And if you have this 50% threshold, then you get a fully notarized checkpoint, which basically is attesting to the fact that all the data in this epoch is available. Now, another name for these fully notarized checkpoints is crosslinks, and you'll see why. The reason is that these signatures, they get included in the beacon chain, and we're going to use the beacon chain as a bridge between the shards, as a way to do cross-linking of the shards. And this is kind of how it works. So let's say you have a transaction in shard 2 who is interested in reading a transaction that happened in shard 1. Okay, and what's going to happen, what we're going to do is that we're going to have the transaction in shard 2 go through the beacon chain, go through this crosslink, and then this crosslink is going to point back to a finalized, a fully notarized checkpoint in shard 1, and then we're going to walk back within the epoch and then go down to a transaction. So basically, these crosslinks are a way to have communication between the shards. But another thing is that these crosslinks are also dual-purposed as Casper votes. So when the beacon chain includes a crosslink, it has, at the very least, 500 signatures. And each signature is going to correspond to a Casper vote of 32 ETH. And so what you have is the crosslinks be kind of a pooled vote, a big Casper vote for the beacon chain in the past. And so the idea of crosslinks and finality plays well together, because once you have finality of a crosslink, the inter-shard communication is very, very strong. Okay, proofs of custody. This is one of a cool crypto economic game. And the idea, just to give a bit of background on proof of custody, let's go back to the problem of data availability. So we have these committees who have two things to do. Number one, they have to download the blocks, and number two, they have to sign off, vouching for the fact that they've been able to download the blocks. And previously, we assumed 2/3 of the validator pool was honest. But now let's make a weaker assumption. Let's assume that 2/3 are rational. They're businessmen as opposed to being angels. And so once we do the sampling, we have 1/2 of the notaries who are rational. And the problem with rational notaries is that they have an incentive to not download the block data. And part of the reason is that there's a real cost to downloading the block data, and there's a reward to participating in a crosslink. And so this is bad. And one of the things that a notary can do, for example, is the idea of copycat voting. So if a notary sees lots of other notaries voting on a crosslink, they can say, oh, well, with very high probability, this, the data in this epoch is available, and so I can just add in my crosslink for very low risk, and I will get a reward. And so what we want to do is we want to make it very, very costly for the notaries to try and vote for a crosslink without having the data. And so what we do is that we take the data that the notary is meant to be vouching for, and we're going to create a very small auxiliary piece of data, actually just 1 bit, which the notary can only compute if he has access to both the data and a secret which is unique to him. So we have the file here. We're going to break down the file in many chunks. and then we're going to add the secret of the validator. So basically, we're mixing in the secret with the data. And the idea is that this makes it impossible to outsource the computation of this custody bit, because if you give the secret away to someone else, that gives them the possibility to slash you and get a reward. So once you've taken the data and you've mixed in the secret, you Merkleize to get a custody root, and then you just have to take the very first bit. So this very first bit is what we call the custody bit, and it's going to be either 0 or 1. And you have two options. You can either download the data and compute the custody bit, or you can decide to not compute the data and basically do a coin flip, choose at random. The problem is that if you choose at random, then you have a 1/2 chance of being slashed, of losing your deposit. And the reason is that at some point you have to reveal your secret. So you've made all these votes, all these claims that I have the data and these are the bits. But you see in the third period, you have to reveal your secret. And once you've revealed your secret, anyone who has the data and the secret can now recompute these bits, and if one of the bits is wrong, they're going to challenge you. And then you'll lose your collateral. Okay. So now towards one of the final new parts of the design, and this is mostly an optimization. So one of the features of sharding is that it's quadratic sharding. Now, what exactly does that mean? It means that the throughput of the overall design is going to be the number of shards times the size of each shard. And the size of each shard is limited by the size of your computer, and also the number of shards is limited by the size of your computer, because all the headers are going to be aggregated into the beacon chain, and the beacon chain itself needs to be relatively small. And so we want to try and come up with optimizations to grow the number of shards by aggregating the messages that go in the beacon chain. And this, we do that in two parts. Number one is message aggregation. So we have this one object, which we call the crosslink, which does many different things. One, as we've talked about, is that they are votes from notaries vouching for the availability of data. Another thing that we've talked about is that they contain a shard checkpoint, and this checkpoint can be used to do cross-shard communication. A third thing that these crosslinks are used for is for voting. So if you vote for the availability of data in a specific shard, you're also making a Casper vote for the beacon chain. And finally, by having these one-bit proofs of custody, you can also include them in the crosslink. And part of the reason why the crosslink is only 400 bytes, is so small, is because of this really cool piece of cryptography called BLS signatures. So the idea of BLS signatures is that if you have a given message and you have lots of people signing the exact same message, well, you can aggregate the signatures in such a way that verifying the aggregate signature is extremely cheap. And in our case, we only have two possible messages, which every validator can sign on, and the two correspond to when your custody bit is 1, and the other one corresponds to when your custody bit is 0. Anyway, it's a technicality. You can take all these signatures and you can aggregate them in such a way that the verification cost is the same as verifying one single signature. And yeah, that's it. Thanks.